45,000 years ago, the air inside the Shanidar cave in the Zagros Mountains didn't smell like the sterile museums where we keep its secrets today. It smelled of damp limestone, wood smoke, and the heavy, musky scent of roasting gazelle meat. Outside, a biting wind whipped through the jagged peaks of northern Iraq. But deep within the stone, there was a different kind of sharpness. It was the sound of a man's breathing, heavy, ragged, and ancient. This man, whom we now call Shanidar I, was not a warrior in his prime. He was old. His right arm was a withered stump, amputated at the elbow years before. His left eye socket was a crushed ruin of bone, leaving him half blind. He limped on a mangled foot, and his ears, clogged with bony growths, could likely only hear the lowest rumbles of the world. He sat in the flickering amber light of a fire, watching the younger members of his group move with a fluid grace he had forgotten decades ago. He was a biological wreck, a man who, by every law of the wild, should have been dead before his first gray hair appeared. And yet, he was here, he was alive, he was fed, and he was home. But the existence of a man like Shanidar I feels like a glitch in the matrix of prehistory. We have been conditioned to believe that the ancient world was a meat grinder that spat out anyone over the age of 30. We imagine a past where the moment you lost a step or a tooth, you were left behind for the wolves. It's a compelling, brutal image of survival of the fittest, a narrative that makes our modern lives feel uniquely enlightened and safe. We look at our retirement homes and our hospitals and think we invented the concept of looking after the vulnerable. We assume that for 99% of our history, getting old was a death sentence carried out by nature itself. Actually, that entire vision of the past is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of math and a total disregard for the physical evidence written in the dirt. When you look at the statistics in a textbook and see that life expectancy in the Paleolithic was 25 or 30 years, your brain does something very human and very wrong. It imagines a world full of 30-year-old elders, people withering away in their third decade like fruit left in the sun. But that number, 30, is a statistical ghost. It is an average, and in the ancient world, averages were skewed by a single, brutal reality: child mortality. In a world without antibiotics or sterile nurseries, about a third of children didn't make it to age 5. If you average a baby who dies in infancy with a hunter who dies at 70, you get a number like 35. It doesn't mean people were dying of old age at 30. It means the start of life was incredibly dangerous. However, once a human being made it past the gauntlet of childhood, the world opened up in a way that would surprise most modern skeptics. In 2007, anthropologists Michael Gervin and Hillard Kaplan decided to stop guessing and start looking at the hard data. They studied modern hunter-gatherer groups that still live in ways similar to our ancestors, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania and the Kung of the Kalahari. What they found shattered the die young myth. They discovered that the most common age of death for an adult who made it to 20 was actually between 68 and 78 years old. Human beings didn't evolve to burn out at 30. We evolved to last for 7 or 8 decades. We are, and always have been, a long-lived species. The gray-haired elder isn't a modern invention. They were a standard feature of the human experience for hundreds of thousands of years. But being capable of living a long time is not the same thing as being cared for. You could argue that these ancient elders were just the lucky ones, the few who managed to keep their teeth and their speed long enough to stay ahead of the predators. You might think that the moment a person became a burden, the compassion of the tribe vanished. This is the nature is red in tooth and claw argument, and it suggests that ancient humans were cold-blooded utilitarians who only valued those who could hunt or gather. Except the bones tell a story that is much more complicated and much more tender. Let's go back even further than Shanidar I, back to 1.77 million years ago, to a site called Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia. Archaeologists there found a skull known as Skull 4. It belonged to an individual of the species Homo erectus. What makes Skull 4 breathtaking isn't its age, but its mouth. This individual had lost all but one of their teeth long before they died. The jawbone had smoothed over, the sockets reabsorbed by the body, a process that takes years of survival in a toothless state. In a world where every meal had to be hunted, gathered, or scavenged, how did a toothless ancestor survive for years? They couldn't chew tough meat or fibrous roots. The only answer is that someone else did it for them. Someone was mashing food, perhaps softening it with fire or stone tools, and feeding it to an elder who could no longer provide for themselves. This wasn't a one-time act of charity. It was a commitment that lasted for years. This level of care isn't an isolated incident. In the Cima de los Huesos, a deep pit in the Atapuerca Mountains of Spain, researchers found the remains of an individual nicknamed Elvis. Elvis was a member of the species Homo heidelbergensis, living about 500,000 years ago. By the time he died, he was over 45 years old, venerable for his time. But his spine told a story of agony. He suffered from severe spondylolisthesis and Bostrup's disease, conditions that would have made every step a trial and rendered him unable to carry heavy loads or hunt effectively. He was a man in constant, debilitating pain. Yet, he lived for years with these conditions. His group didn't leave him behind when they moved. They slowed their pace. They didn't stop feeding him when he couldn't hunt. They shared their catch. Still, you have to ask why. Evolution is a cold accountant. It rarely rewards behaviors that don't contribute to the survival of the species. Why would a group of starving hominids spend their precious calories on a man who couldn't hunt, a woman who couldn't bear more children, or an elder who limped? If the old were just a drain on resources, the groups that abandoned them should have outcompeted the groups that kept them. But that's not what happened. In fact, it seems like the groups that kept their elders were the ones that eventually inherited the earth. But biological necessity is a blunt tool for explaining the warmth of a grandmother's hands. To understand why we evolved to live so long, we have to look at the work of Kristen Hawkes, an anthropologist who spent years among the Hadza people. She noticed something that had been invisible to researchers for decades. When mothers were busy with new infants, they couldn't spend all day digging for the deep, difficult tubers that provide a massive chunk of the tribe's calories. The young men were often away, chasing the high-risk, low-reward prize of big game. The people who were actually keeping the tribe from starving were the postmenopausal women. These grandmothers were the most efficient foragers in the camp. They knew exactly which plants were calorie-dense, which ones were medicinal, and which ones could be found even in the height of a drought. Because they weren't nursing infants, they could work longer and harder, and the food they gathered went directly to their grandchildren. Hawkes proposed the grandmother hypothesis, which suggests that human longevity didn't happen by accident. It was selected for. The children of grandmothers who lived longer had a much higher survival rate. They were better fed, better protected, and better taught. Over hundreds of generations, the genes for a long life were passed down not by the strongest hunters, but by the hardest working grandmothers. We don't live long in spite of menopause. We live long because menopause created a class of dedicated, expert providers who ensured the next generation didn't die. Nevertheless, food is only one kind of survival. A tribe can have all the tubers in the world and still perish if they don't know where to go when the sky turns black or the rivers dry up. This is where the elder shifts from being a provider of calories to being a provider of something much more valuable: information. In a world without books, the internet, or even writing, every single thing a culture knew was stored in the gray matter of its oldest members. Think about the sheer volume of data an 80-year-old woman in the Stone Age would have carried. She had seen 3 once-in-a-generation droughts. She knew which hidden spring still held water when the main river was a bed of cracked mud. She remembered the migration patterns of the herds from the last time the climate shifted. She knew how to treat a snake bite, how to stitch a wound with sinew, and how to tell the difference between a poisonous mushroom and its edible twin. She was a living, breathing encyclopedia. If that woman died, it was as if a library had burned to the ground. In 2004, anthropologists Rachel Kasperi and Sang-Hee Lee published a study that looked at the ratio of old to young adults in the fossil record. They looked at everything from early Australopithecines to Neanderthals to early modern humans. What they found was a massive demographic shift about 30,000 years ago during the Upper Paleolithic. Suddenly, the number of people living into old age didn't just increase. It quintupled. And at that exact same moment, human culture exploded. This is the era of the first intricate cave paintings, the first complex jewelry, the first long-distance trade, and the first sophisticated burials. It wasn't that we suddenly got smarter. It was that we finally had enough elders to keep the fire of knowledge burning. When you have grandparents, you have teachers. When you have teachers, you don't have to spend your whole life relearning how to make a needle or how to track a wounded bison. You can start where the previous generation left off. The evolution of grandparents was the catalyst for the human revolution. We became the masters of the planet not because we were faster or stronger than the leopards, but because we had a memory that lived for 70 years. Yet for all this evidence of honor and utility, there is a shadow that hangs over our perception of the ancient old. It is the story of the ice flow. We have all heard the trope of the Inuit elder being placed on a floating hunk of ice and pushed out to sea to die of exposure once they become a burden. It's a story that has been used for a century to illustrate the primitive cruelty of life in the wild. It's a story that suggests that even the most loving cultures have a breaking point where the old must be sacrificed for the young. Except when you actually look into the ethnography, the reality is far more nuanced and far more heartbreaking. Knud Rasmussen, the great explorer of the Arctic, did find cases of senicide, but they were vanishingly rare. They didn't happen as a matter of course. They happened only during the most extreme famines, when the entire group was literally days away from starvation. And in almost every documented case, it wasn't the group that decided to abandon the elder. It was the elder who insisted on it. It was a final, desperate act of love. An old man or woman would choose to stop eating or choose to stay behind in a blizzard so that their children and grandchildren would have one more day of rations. It wasn't an act of abandonment. It was the ultimate act of protection. It was the final lesson an elder could teach, how to die so that the tribe might live. But even those rare moments of sacrifice were exceptions to the global rule. In almost every traditional culture we know of, age was synonymous with authority. Among the Aboriginal people of Australia, the elders are the custodians of the dreaming, the complex web of songs and stories that map the entire continent. You couldn't even belong to the land without an elder to teach you its secrets. Among the San of the Kalahari, the elders aren't just cared for. They are the center of the social world. They are the ones who mediate disputes, who remember the lineages, and who lead the healing dances. They are the heart of the camp. We often think of ancient life as a constant, frantic struggle for the next meal, leaving no time for sentiment. But the archaeology of burials suggests otherwise. In the site of Sungir in Russia, dating back 34,000 years, researchers found an old man buried in a costume decorated with nearly 3,000 ivory beads. These beads took thousands of hours to carve. This was a man who couldn't have been a primary hunter for a long time, yet he was buried with a level of wealth and effort that is staggering. His people didn't just tolerate him, they revered him. They used their most precious resources to send him into the afterlife with the dignity of a king. So, what happened? Why do we find it so hard to believe that our ancestors loved their old? Perhaps it's because it's easier to view the past as a place of darkness and cruelty so that we don't have to look too closely at our own present. Today, we live longer than any humans in history. We have the technology to replace hips, to clear cataracts, and to keep hearts beating for a century, but we have also done something our ancestors would have found incomprehensible. We have separated the old from the world. We have turned aging into a medical condition to be managed rather than a stage of life to be honored. We put the old behind sliding doors in facilities where they are cared for by strangers on a schedule. We spend billions on creams and procedures to hide the very thing our ancestors saw as a trophy of survival, the wrinkles and the gray hair. We have the longest lived elders in history, and we have the least use for them. We have the libraries, but we've forgotten how to read the books. But the biology doesn't care about our modern preferences. Deep in our DNA, we are still the same creatures who sat in Shanidar Cave. Our brains are still wired to lean forward when an old person begins to tell a story. We still have that instinctual respect for the person who has seen more winters than we have. It's the reason why, even today, a grandparent's house feels like a sanctuary. It's a remnant of a time when the presence of an elder meant you were safe, you were fed, and you were part of a story that went back forever. We should remember that for the vast majority of our history, being useful didn't mean being able to run fast or lift heavy things. It meant being the person who knew where the medicinal herbs grew. It meant being the person who could calm a crying child with a song that was 500 years old. It meant being the person who remembered the names of the ancestors so that the tribe didn't lose its soul. The old weren't a burden, they were the anchor. Think about the man in the cave one more time. Shanidar I didn't survive because he was lucky. He survived because 45,000 years ago, a group of Neanderthals looked at a one-armed, half-blind, limping man and didn't see a mouth to feed. They saw a father. They saw a brother. They saw a man who knew things they didn't, a man who had survived the things they were currently afraid of. They saw a library. They spent years mashing his food and helping him over the rough rocks of the mountainside because they knew that without him, they were just a collection of individuals. But with him, they were a people. They understood that the value of a human life isn't measured in what you can take from the world, but in what you can remember of it. They knew that an old person is the only thing that stands between a culture and the void, and they were willing to work, to sacrifice, and to slow down their own lives just to keep that memory alive for one more day. They lived in a world that was infinitely more dangerous than ours, a world where a single bad winter could wipe out an entire clan. And yet they made room. They made room for the slow. They made room for the weak. They made room for the ones whose only contribution was a story told over a fire. They were primitive by every definition we have, and yet they practiced a level of communal compassion that we struggle to replicate in our world of infinite resources. The next time you see a face lined with age, don't look at it as a map of what has been lost. Look at it as a map of what has been saved. Every wrinkle is a famine survived. Every gray hair is a lesson learned. Every age spot is a memory that was kept alive when it would have been easier to let it flicker out. We are a species of grandparents. We are the children of the elders who refuse to die and the tribes who refuse to let them go. And that brings us back to the very beginning, back to that cold wind in the Zagros Mountains and the flickering light in the Shanidar Cave. Imagine you are there, standing in the shadows, watching that group care for the man with the crushed eye. You see the tenderness in how they hand him a piece of soft meat. You see the way the children huddle around his knees to hear the low rumble of his voice. You see a culture that is whole. Then, look at that smooth, toothless jawbone again. In a museum case, it looks like a sign of fragility, a piece of a life that was broken by time. But when you understand the context of its survival, that jawbone changes. It becomes something else entirely. It becomes a definitive, chilling closing argument against the idea that we were ever meant to be alone. It is the physical proof that the most powerful tool we ever evolved wasn't the hand axe, or the spear, or the fire. It was the refusal to leave each other behind. That jawbone isn't a symbol of weakness, it is the strongest thing in the room. It is the evidence that we became human the moment we decided that an old man's stories were worth more than the calories it took to keep him alive. The real mystery isn't what ancient humans did when they got old. The real mystery is why we ever stopped doing it. We live in a world where we have more elders than ever before, and yet we are lonelier than we have ever been. Perhaps it's time to go back to the cave. Not to the cold or the danger, but to the fire, to the realization that the oldest person in the room isn't a reminder of the end, but the only person who can tell you where you began. Because in the end, we are all just sitting in the flickering light of a fire, waiting for someone to tell us a story. We are all searching for a way to stay relevant in a world that moves too fast. And if we're lucky, truly lucky, we will live long enough to become the ones who remember where the water is hidden. We will live long enough to be the libraries that someone else refuses to let burn. The story of aging isn't a story of decline. It's a story of accumulation. It's the process of turning a life into a legacy, and that legacy is the only reason we are here at all. The ancient world knew this. They lived it every single day, in every softened meal, and every slowed-down migration. They knew that the old were the keepers of the light. And if we want to survive the winters to come, we might want to start listening to the stories again before the last of the libraries are gone. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into our shared past. If these stories of ancient compassion and the secret history of our ancestors move you, I'd be honored if you'd consider staying a while. We spend a lot of time in these rabbit holes, trying to remember what it means to be human. If you have an elder in your life who has shared a piece of wisdom that changed how you see the world, I'd love to hear about it. We're all just trying to keep the fire going, and your stories are the fuel. Until next time, keep looking back. The past has more to say than you might think.